Hi, today we are in San Jose in the Ensighten office. Hi Josh, who are you and what do you do?
Well, I'm Josh Manion. I'm the CEO and founder of Ensighten. We're a digital marketing company that is really trying to transform the way that large enterprises collect, own, and act on all the digital data that they have about their customers. So anything from their website to their mobile apps to their display ads, social media, and we've been at it for just over 5 years now.
Cool. What did you do before and what made you come up with the business idea of Ensighten?
Sure. If you think about what I was doing for this, I guess 7 to 8 years before starting Ensighten, I was running a digital analytics agency, and my wife and I had started that company, and it was based in Chicago. We generally worked with big enterprise customers, so sort of a similar customer overlap to what we have now. And to me, there was just this growing opportunity that existed and I'll sort of describe the dynamics that revealed it to me, which was we would watch these large enterprises go from working with anywhere from, when we first started that digital analytics agency, probably 2 or 3 different marketing technology or ad tech vendors, and this was sort of like 2002 type time period, right? They'd only have, a small handful of those. And then by the time that we started Ensighten, they were working with dozens and dozens of those per enterprise, and in some cases hundreds, depending on the size and business model of the particular enterprise that we were working with. And what I observed was that the enterprise they were getting value and they were creating a positive ROI out of all the initiatives that they were pursuing with these vendors. But what they were not doing was keeping up with the potential value of what they were creating. So if you think of like moving from 3 vendors to 30 vendors, you would have this exponential explosion in sort of the potential value of what you could get out of those solutions. Mm-hmm. But instead, they would just have like this tiny little linear increase of, okay, well, we're getting more out, but nowhere near what the potential value was. And to me, it seemed like there were 2 big issues that existed that were stopping them. The first was this concept of marketing agility. So if a marketer wants to do something, right? Maybe it's collect a piece of data, maybe it's launch a new campaign, maybe it's try out a new vendor, whatever it might be. They literally couldn't do it. They would sit there and they would go to their IT department and they would say, hey, can you put this little piece of code on all of my different pages? And the IT department would say, but you have hundreds of thousands of these little different pages. That's going to take months to do. And the marketer would respond with something like, but that doesn't work because the campaign's launching like in 3 days. I need it now. Yeah. And so they would respond with, well, there's not really you're not going to get that data then. Or whatever the scenario would be, right? Essentially they were continually bottlenecked by their own process and systems that didn't give the marketers the ability to keep up with sort of what the customer was expecting. The second issue was the data itself. So if you think about working with, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Lumascape, it's like this eye chart that has like 2,000 vendors on it, and it literally maps the growth of the digital marketing ecosystem and sort of the ad tech ecosystem over the years. Mm-hmm. And so they put everybody in these tiny little categories and shrink the logos down. Mm-hmm. It's completely overwhelming. But what you find that's common about those thousands of vendors that are on there is that they own all of the data that those enterprises are collecting. So the enterprise would essentially engage in this model that would say, let me reach out to you as a vendor, let me pay you to put your code on my site, then you would collect my data, but you would collect it in a format that's first party to you and third party to me, which makes it virtually impossible for me to join it with any other data. And if I ever need that data, you're probably either going to rent it or sell it back to me. Yeah. And it was really rather crazy if you think about it from, just with sort of with a beginner's mind. But that was what everyone was used to. That was how ad servers worked, and so that was just sort of the standard that expanded. And so that phenomenon of creating all of these different silos, so if I stick with that example where I said you have 30 different vendors on your site, those 30 vendors now have created at least, and sometimes more, than 30 different silos of data. Mm-hmm. So your ad server will have one view of who that customer is. Your website analytics tool will have another. Your mobile analytics tool will probably have another. Your personalization engine will have another. And what you create is this concept of never knowing who your customer is, or you're always treating them as if you either don't know them or you know different random facts about them. Yeah. And so it provides a very choppy sort of user experience as they I guess, progress through this journey of either learning about your company, becoming a customer, becoming a repeat customer, optimizing the lifetime value of the customer, etc. And so the opportunity in my mind was to solve that by essentially giving the enterprise one consistent view of who that customer is, that was first party to them, that was completely owned by them, and that would be actionable for all of those vendors to sort of seamlessly plug into. And so when you really boil down what we're doing in the space, the two things that disrupt the space the most are we are taking that actionability or that agility platform that was first describing, and we're creating an environment where the marketer can just drag and drop something and collect any piece of data, try out a new vendor, but without any involvement from their IT department, their developers, et cetera. So it can literally happen in minutes now instead of weeks or months or whatever it used to take. And then the second piece is we're allowing them to create this data profile that is truly, encompasses the entire journey of the visitor. And when you combine those things together, what you do is you create a network effect for the enterprise themselves that says, well, if I work with 30 vendors now, using a platform like Ensighten actually makes all 30 of those vendors more powerful because they're able to access a unified profile, so they're all able to make a slightly smarter decision on each interaction. And we do other things. We make them faster, we make them easier to manage, and there's less overhead in sort of having a number of vendors that exist on the site. And so if you're the enterprise, you now have a very strong incentive to start working with vendor number 31 because the original 30 get better when you bring in number 31 or 32 or so on. Right. And so that really just sort of stemmed from that consulting work that we were doing at this digital analytics agency for the 7 years prior. And when I saw that, I was shocked that no one else was doing it. It was sort of like, it came to me, I started doing a bunch of research, and there were people kind of poking around the edges of it, but there was no one who was really taking that vision to the market the way that I wanted to. And so spun out of that company, and the rest is history.
Cool. Josh, how does it work? So imagine I install this kind of simplified, the tag manager on my company. So I have like 30 vendors who I'm plugging into.
Right.
How do you join the data then from those 30 vendors?
Sure. So it starts with the implementation of the tag management system itself, right? So if I gave you a card before, but if on the back of the card is the implementation guide itself. Mm-hmm. So single line of code, and one of the core requirements that we had from the onset was the implementation of our platform has to eliminate the complexity that has traditionally existed, where it would be, I want to implement a web analytics tool, and it would take months of complexity to configure it and customize it and capture all the events and EVARs and the SPROPs and the custom variables that you want to capture. And so that single line of code never changes for the client. Once they put it there, they're able to take any net new vendor and essentially just take them out of our library. We have over 1,000 vendors in our app library, and literally just drag them onto the site, put in their user ID and password, and configure them. Now, for vendors that are already on their site, this is actually the hardest part of the, well, I usually describe it this way. You're implemented the moment you put the line of code on the site, and most of our customers start doing net new things immediately. United Airlines was an example of this. They first started working with us right after they merged with Continental. They had a list of 12 things that they wanted to deploy on the new combined website. Ensighten came up as part of that new platform of the combined company, and they realized that once they put the line of code on the site, those 12 new vendors, they were done in less than a month, and they had planned the entire year to do it. And that was a great example of sort of the agility that they could sort of generate from being able to just do any forward-looking things immediately. Now, the harder part of this is generally when you have an existing site and you want to take, let's say you're taking 10 vendors off that site and you want to redeploy them. The redeployment is actually very, very easy. The hardest part of this process, not surprisingly, given sort of the legacy and sort of the challenge that you're trying to get away from, is you need to have your IT department go in and actually remove them. And so taking the code off the pages, and many of our customers actually will delay that because it's a traditional IT project. Yeah. And so they'll say, well, you know what, next time we refresh the site, I'll get it off, but just start managing it. And Ensighten has a bunch of ways that we can manage the code that's already there, and it won't be quite as performance optimized as it would be if it was all flowing through our system, but it allows the customer to get immediate value out of it.
Josh, you also said that you changed the kind of paradigm from having third-party data to really owning the data. That's right. As a customer. Imagine I've installed or implemented the Tag Manager. I have something like Google Analytics on there.
Yeah.
Are you able to push me in real time the raw data of what the customer is doing on my website?
Absolutely. So, and thanks for reminding me, because I didn't answer your full question before, which was, if you think about how we're changing the data paradigm, right? Now, when a customer who wants to own that data asset, what they're effectively doing is they're creating their own copy specific to that individual, and that, and if you stick with like United Airlines example, or Microsoft, or Sony, or American Express, or any of our customers, what you end up with is they will take and start creating their own first party, right, keyed to a first party cookie that is only accessible to them. And they will start collecting the superset of all the data that goes. So in your example, the data that goes to Google Analytics, they'll also choose to collect that. If they're using a voice of customer solution like Opinion Lab, they'll also collect that data. If they're using a personalization engine, they'll collect whether or not that test A versus test B was working for this particular visitor, or which segment they're in, et cetera. And so absolutely we can provide that data in real time to them. And a number of our customers, like actually there was just an article in Ad Exchanger about Coke and how they use our platform to do exactly that use case, where they're collecting all of that data. And their model has been to not work with a traditional web analytics tool, but to feed all of that data as a real-time stream into their enterprise data warehouse, where they do, apply all the sophisticated BI tools that they have against that data for, the modeling and the data science teams that they have there. But the important element here is that, and sometimes I show this with, if I was talking to a prospect, I would actually kind of show a chart that shows like on, imagine the customer views an ad. Well, in that world, the ad server, let's say it's DoubleClick, has a data point about that customer. You viewed an ad, maybe you clicked on it, maybe you didn't. In our world, Ensighten would also have a copy of that, or the customer ultimately. Take Coke as the example. Coke would have that same piece of data. Now something happens on the website. Now DoubleClick won't have any view of that, right? This would be, let's say it was Web Trends or whatever the web analytics tool was. Well, Web Trends will have one data piece now. Well, Ensighten will also have that data piece. So now we have two data pieces in Ensighten, and you have two systems with one data pieces. And you can sort of extend that down through, okay, now I'm interacting with a mobile app, I'm on a social media platform, I'm doing all of these things. And it starts to become very clear that Ensighten has the master data set, whereas all of these other things are just these little fragments of, okay, this is one channel's interaction, or this is one media type, or this is only things on my owned properties, or these are only things on purchased or paid media.
Do you also provide analytic tools based on your Ensighten stuff, or is it only that you are collecting all the data and then pumping the data to your customer?
Sure. So we actually do both. So philosophically, we're very, very committed to the idea that our platform and the data needs to be open. So our customers can connect any third-party vendor they want to that, and they can extract that at any level of granularity. Whether it was like the Coke example of a real-time stream of that data coming out, or they want batch exports or whatever it might be. So that's philosophically very important. But we very, very quickly kind of learned that our customers, of course, now have this really rich data set. They want to have Ensighten. They want to be able to natively explore it without taking it out of the platform and sort of taking additional work. So we actually did an acquisition in 2014 where we acquired an omni-channel data analytics platform. And mainly because of this specific use case. We had this tremendously differentiated data set, and we wanted to rapidly accelerate our customers' ability to explore and model that data and do omni-channel data analysis and segmentation of their customers. So yeah, we have a whole solution on that side as well.
Josh, you are supporting thousands of vendors for the platform. When you started out, I mean, you didn't. I guess you didn't support that many. But what were the first 3 or 6 months look like? How did you start building the product, finding customers?
Yeah, vendor support first. One of the core tenets, we actually started with 4 key requirements for the system. One was this one line of code that I referenced earlier. The second was that we had to support every vendor completely natively, whether they existed today or they would exist in the future with no modification. Number 3 was we had to work in every digital touch point. So it wasn't just a web tool. It had to work in mobile. It had to work in Internet of Things. It had to work in any of these emerging devices, ATM machines, kiosks, whatever it could be. And then number 4 was it had to make all of those experiences faster. It had to be a better customer experience. If you loaded that code here, it would load faster and derive a better customer experience. And so the way we got that was by not forcing any vendor to modify themselves at all, we were able to just sort of natively support and take, even though we didn't have fancy apps like we do now on our app marketplace and partnerships with all of these guys, we were able to literally create an environment where someone could cut and paste the solution and say, well, I want to run this version of this vendor, cut and paste, boom, it's done. And so very, very easy. Now the question about how did we get started, I think we had a little bit of an advantage because coming from that digital analytics agency world, I knew a lot of enterprise customers. And I had at least enough credibility with those customers that, and sort of a reputation in the space that when I would call someone up at one of these big enterprises, they wouldn't just slam the phone down. Yeah. Because I used to have these conversations that would go something like this. I would say, if I could replace all the tags on your site with a single line of code, it would make your site faster. You would never have to talk to your IT department again. Would you be interested? And they would be like, of course, but you don't have something that does that. And then I'm like, but no, I do. And they're like, well, you've never lied to me before, so come on in and I'll at least look at a demo.
Yeah.
And that was literally how we got our first handful of customers, which were people like Nestle Purina, Putnam Investments, Sony Electronics, etc. So we had, we were fortunate in being able to sort of acquire those, sort of first handful of customers in our first few months of operation. And we took a slightly different sort of path than a lot of Silicon Valley startups. It wasn't go, come up with the idea, go up and down Sand Hill Road, raise a bunch of money, and then spend a year building a product and then go to market. We did it sort of completely backwards. So we went to, recognize the need and the problem, and started bootstrapping the company based on the success of the prior company, which was a luxury, and then as soon as we had an initial version of the product, we were also fortunate that we were able to pretty easily attract people to say, well, would you help us beta test this and validate whether it works, and does it really solve the problem that we say it does, and what else would you like to see in it? And so when the company started, which was, we officially incorporated on the last day of 2009, by February of 2010, we were literally closing our first paying customers, which were generally people coming out of that beta program that we'd already been working with.
As you have lots of B2B customers, and especially bigger ones.
Yep.
And from my understanding, they have much longer sales cycles. How did you solve this kind of problem? Because you're starting out, then you're somehow cash strained.
No, that was a challenging thing for us for sure, because we had this initial excitement when we launched the product, and we closed our first half dozen customers, like boom, 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 in the first few months. And myself and other early folks here thought, okay, wow, this is just going to take off if we just, we're going to really make this huge. And then all of a sudden, it was like we didn't sell again for like 2 quarters. Yeah. And we had lots of demos and we had lots of prospects, and we just did not get people weren't signing contracts. Yeah. And part of it is exactly what you said. The enterprise sales cycle is a long one. Part of it was just the adoption cycle of a new technology. We were in a category that really didn't exist before. People didn't have budgets set aside for tag management or the sort of digital marketing platform optimization in this way. And so they would see a demo and say, wow, that's awesome, I want it, but I don't have any money, I don't know how I would even get this, maybe I'll ask for it next year, that kind of discussion would go on. And so it was about 6 months where we were just struggling, just closing 1-2 customers, through that period of time. And then all of a sudden the market started to mature to the point where those early customers that we had were starting to have great success and have, a phenomenal ROI story. So that made it easier to sell to other ones. And it just started to become a little bit more mainstream. People started to say, "Oh, okay, I know somebody who's done that, who's had experience with it." We started to get some of our early customers onto the speaking circuit within sort of the industry trade shows and so on. So they were publicizing and helping us publicize. And there was just sort of that intangible timing element, right, which is so tricky when you're doing a startup, because you can have the best idea, and if your timing is just off, you can blow through all your cash and be done. So, but yeah, that was definitely a challenge for us, because we weren't sure when the market would truly sort of mature and be ready for it.
Josh, I totally understand the advantages of using a tag manager like Ensighten. Like it's only single line of code, and you join lots of other data sources. Totally get it. But what are the downsides of using something like this? I don't know, maybe page load speed, performance.
Sure. Well, so page load speed actually accelerates.
Really?
So it accelerates because for a few reasons. One, we can deploy a specialized infrastructure to serve these little chunks of code, right? Which, if you think about what most websites serve their content through, it'll be through a CDN like an Akamai or something, which is optimized for big files, images, videos, etc. And so, the underlying files of these tags and these vendors tend to be these really small, 2, 3, 4 kilobyte little JavaScript files. And so what you would do to optimize your infrastructure to serve those is quite different than what you would do to optimize for big video and image files. So that's one. The second is that we can control how they load. So we can as opposed to loading them all synchronously and saying you wait until they all load, which is how some poorly implemented sites would affect. We're able to dynamically insert them at just the right place in the site, so that the site becomes interactive and that it becomes functional much sooner than it would have otherwise. And then the third piece is, if you think about a high complexity site, like let's say somebody who's got 50 tags or more, most of those tags literally don't apply to every visitor. They apply to some of the visitors, right? So if you're coming from this campaign, then run this code. But I might have done that 20 times in there. So, any one visitor will only have one of those 20 tags actually be applicable to them. In the old world, all 20 would run, all 20 would collect that visitor's data, which is a privacy issue, even though it's irrelevant to them. In our world, Ensighten would actually dynamically decide, hey, this visitor has only this piece is relevant to them. And so in that case, you'd actually save 95% of the load, because we would only bring down the tag that needs to run for that one individual. And so the other 19 tags literally don't even need to download or execute for that visitor. For the next one, it might be a different one, but it's able to essentially personalize which tags go. And so you can take a huge amount out of the payload that needs to both be downloaded and the burden you put on the browser in terms of processing that code and actually executing it. So the downside case is, honestly, I would say there really isn't a strong one, in the sense of the value proposition is sort of so self-evident. It's very similar to content management, in the sense that you would generally not want to start running a website without a platform like this. It just doesn't make sense to do this stuff by hand. If you were going to dig deep for downside case, right, you'd say, well, IT is giving up control, just like they would with a content management system. Someone could post a piece of inappropriate content, or in this case, they could literally do something, without the appropriate sort of guardrails in place. And we invest heavily to sort of create those guardrails for people. But no matter what you do, somebody could potentially hurt themselves with it, or break a site, or launch something that interferes with some other piece of functionality on the site if there isn't the appropriate workflow and sort of testing in place. And I mean that's the biggest objection that we typically hear, is that IT and security, in particular in financial services, they really want to make sure that there's a really enterprise class solution in place that has security, workflows, permissioning, that the data is secure, because what we're really talking about is a sensitive asset. For a global enterprise, or any of our European customers in particular, that can be a very sensitive topic.
Right. And how do you go about this safe harbor topic? Because, for example, for European customers.
Sure. You mean in terms of storage of their data?
Yeah, right.
I mean, so for European customers who want to take advantage of that universal profile, then that data will literally be stored in European data centers and not allowed to transport back to North America, which is a little bit more challenging from an infrastructure standpoint. But again, I think one of the reasons that you want to go with a real enterprise class vendor in the space as opposed to some of the maybe the smaller guys that are out there.
Okay. Josh, how's the revenue model working and how did you decide about the pricing?
Sure. So revenue model is pretty traditional SaaS-based, software.
Mm-hmm.
So it's generally an annual subscription to our service, and that's like any of the SaaS-based technologies out there. So you'll sign up for a year or 2 or 3 years, depending on how long you want to commit and how big of a discount you want to get. Generally, that will also be based on the volume of transactions that you have going on. So how frequently you'll be interacting with our platform, right? So if you're used to buying a web analytics tool, it'll generally be the same kind of model of like, well, I'm used to buying 1 billion page views for my site, then I would buy 1 billion, server calls from Ensighten to help support that. Because generally, each interaction we're going to be responding with, here's the customized piece of code for this visitor and these tags that apply to them, and so on. Let's see, the pricing and how we started with it. I think anytime you're starting out, it's very hard to figure out what is the value to your customer, and you generally also have very little idea what your own costs are even in delivering it, right? Because you're very early stage, you're not at scale, you're losing money no matter what you charge. So it's tricky. We actually started with a domain-based pricing model, so trying to say that people could put it all over their domain and it wasn't server call based. That turned out to be a little bit cumbersome for some of our big clients. So as we started to work with really big organizations like Microsoft, they would say, well, that's great, but it kind of, here's an example with our store where we have 100 domains across 100 different countries, and that kind of works for you. But then if we go and put you on Microsoft.com, and that's one domain, and it's billions and billions and billions of requests, that kind of works for us. Now, in aggregate, it kind of balances out in a customer like that, so it's not that big of a deal. But they were actually one that helped drive us to the decision to move to server call based pricing, because they were much more able to allocate the cost across the different business units, and so they would buy in large quantity and then allocate across many different business units, and they found that model made it a lot easier than domain based, where they might have a small group consuming a very little amount of traffic but might have a lot of domains, and it wasn't necessarily good.
And for the pricing, did you rather use the cost-based pricing, value-based pricing, or just by looking at competitive pricing?
Sure. So when we started, there really wasn't a competitive example, right? There was actually a company in Europe called Tagman who we bought last year in 2014. But we weren't seeing them in a lot of the North American deals when we were just starting. And so, our primary goal was to try to find a value-based price that worked, right? Which was associated with the value that customers paid. And where I think we ultimately ended up was that you tended to be a combination of value-based pricing, but also sort of correlating based on what other guys in the marketing tech stack were charging and what people were used to. So if they were used to paying $100,000 a year for a solution, then they might be equally happy to pay $100,000 for ours, but they wouldn't pay $200.
Yeah, right.
And so it was that sort of a tweaking of the model that would take place in the first couple of years. And
Josh, you said that especially in the beginning, you don't have a good idea of how the cost function is working, how the revenue function is working. How often did you need to adjust the pricing model?
We tried not to adjust it that often because it was tricky. In that first, say, 5 customers, it got adjusted a lot just because we were, you're not really even sure if you're in the right ballpark, and you're trying to calibrate, and your customers are telling you what's appropriate and what they feel good about, and you want it to be in that zone where they feel really good that they're getting a really strong ROI, but it's also, when you start dropping that into your models, you'd say, okay, I can see how that will work for me. It's not like, I'm going to charge you $10 a month, and okay.
Cool. Josh, let's talk about your advice to first-time entrepreneurs. So what type of learnings have you learned over the last 5 years? Sure.
Well, I think there's a few things, right? I mean, I think that, one thing that has always been true in my mind here and starting companies is the faster you can get a product in front of the customer and you can actually get live feedback, and the closer you can get to, even if it's not a paid sale, but the idea of getting live product, working in a customer environment and seeing that to me is the fastest path to creating value. And I see a lot of entrepreneurs that I talk with or have coffee with that feel like they can't do that, or that they want, we need to raise our seed round before we can do that. And I'm always find myself encouraging them, do anything. It doesn't need to be pretty. You don't need to have a UI. You just need to demonstrate that what you're talking about, number one, works, and number two, creates value for the customer. If you do those two things, and if you even add in the third element, if they're actually paying you anything for it, that create, now we've got something to work with in terms of creating a business, or if you're interested in raising outside funds or whatnot. Those are things that the vast majority of companies that investors see don't have, at least early stage investors. And so you're taking these massive elements of risk and just eliminating it. We talked a little bit about one of the things that I would also add in that category, which is timing. You have to be very, very conscious of the timing, and not only have that patience when you have a market that maybe you're a little bit ahead of, but making sure that you create the strategy for the company, and in particular the financing strategy for the company that's associated with that. I think, for example, if we'd have we ended up bootstrapping for almost 3 years before we ended up raising our first sort of professional investment. And I honestly believe if we had raised money earlier, especially during that period I was describing where we weren't selling any customers, we would have probably burned through a ton of money. And I don't think any amount of money was going to change the fact that the market wasn't ready to buy. Yeah. And so we could have gotten ourselves into a very bad situation where we'd set expectations with investors, we'd disappointed, we've already raised money, we've taken dilution, and now we're in we were much more nimble in being able to navigate that situation as a bootstrap company that was just like, well, okay, well, we won't hire anybody. We're not selling customers. Yeah. And that's very easy to make there. But if you raise your Series A, there's the expectation, well, are you hiring these people? Are you scaling? Are you? And it allows it to progress a little bit more naturally, I think, on that side.
Cool. Josh, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge.
Absolutely.
That's very much fun.
Oh, I appreciate the time.
Cool. And next time you are thinking about what are the customers actually doing on my website, and really in a combined data set, maybe you can think of Ensighten. Thanks.